President's own lead outside counsel, Rudy Giuliani, also seemed to concede that the vice president did not have the authority to decide the outcome of the election or send it back to the states. Here's what White House Attorney Eric Hirschman said about his call with Mayor Giuliani on the morning of the 6th.
The morning of January 6th, I think he called me out of the blue, right? And I was like getting dressed. And we had an intellectual discussion about Eastman's, I don't know if it's Eastman's theory per se, but the VP's role. And he was asking me my view and analysis and then the practical implications of it. And when we finished, he said, like, I believe that, you're probably right. I think he thought when we're done that it would be something he'd have to consider if he was sitting on the bench. But he'd probably come down in that, you couldn't interpret it or sustain the argument long term.
Of course, the fact that Mayor Giuliani seemed to admit that the theory was wrong did not stop him from going before the crowd just a few hours later on January 6th and saying the exact opposite. Here's Mayor Giuliani's speech at the Ellipse rally on January 6th.
We're here just very briefly to make a very important 2 points. Number one, every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal. I have Professor Eastman here with me to say a few words about that. He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars in the United States. It is perfectly appropriate, given the questionable constitutionality of the Election Counting Act of 1887, that the vice president can cast it aside, and he can do what a president called Jefferson did when he was vice president. He can decide on the validity of these crooked ballots, or he can send it back to the legislatures, give them 5 to 10 days to finally finish the work.
And here's what Dr. Eastman said in his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
Even Dr. Eastman knew his theory didn't hold water. Mr. Jacob, you discussed and even debated this theory at length with Dr. Eastman. Did Dr. Eastman ever tell you what he thought the U.S. Supreme Court would do if it had to decide this issue?
Yes. We had an extended discussion, an hour and a half to 2 hours on January 5th. And when I pressed him on the point, I said, John, if the vice president did what you were asking him to do, we would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court, wouldn't we? And he initially started it, well, I think maybe you would lose only 7-2. And after some further discussion, acknowledged, well, yeah, you're right, we would lose 9-0.
I appreciate that. In our investigation, the Select Committee has obtained evidence suggesting that Dr. Eastman never really believed his own theory. Let me explain. On the screen, you can see a draft letter to the president from October 2020. In this letter, an idea was proposed that the vice president could determine which electors to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in blue wrote, quote, "The 12th Amendment only says that the President of the Senate opens the ballots in the joint session and then, in the passive voice, that the votes shall then be counted." The comments in blue further state, "Nowhere does it suggest that the President of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own." Judge Luttig, does it surprise you that the author of those comments in blue was in fact John Eastman?
Yes, it does, Congressman. But let me, watching this unfold, let me try to unpack what was at the root of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election. And it is this, and I had foreshadowed this answer in my earlier testimony to Congresswoman Cheney. Mr. Eastman, from the beginning, said to the president that there was both legal as well as historical precedent for the vice president to overturn the election. And what we've heard today, I believe, is what happened within the White House and elsewhere as all the players led by Mr. Eastman got wrapped around the axle by the historical evidence claim by Mr. Eastman. Let me explain very simply. This is what I said would require a digression that I would be glad to undertake if you wished. In short, if I had been advising the Vice President of the United States on January 6th, and even if then Vice President Jefferson and even then Vice President John Adams and even then Vice President Richard Nixon had done exactly what the President of the United States wanted his Vice President to do. I would have laid my body across the road before I would have let the Vice President overturn the 2020 election on the basis of that historical precedent. But what this body needs to know, and now America needs to know, is that that was the centerpiece of the plan to overturn the 2020 election. It was the historical precedent in the years and with the vice presidents that I named, as Congressman Raskin understands well. And the effort by Mr. Eastman and others was to drive that historical precedent up to and under that single sentence, single pristine sentence in the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution, taking advantage of, if you will, what many have said is the inartful wording of that sentence in the 12th Amendment. Scholars before 2020 would have used that historical precedent to argue not that Vice President Pence could overturn the 2020 election, by accepting non-certified state electoral votes. But they would have made arguments as to some substantive, not merely procedural, authority possessed by the Vice President of the United States on the statutorily prescribed day for counting the Electoral College votes. This is constitutional mischief.